We're going to begin our section on the female reproductive system by looking at a general drawing of the internal structures of the female reproductive system. There's a picture like this in your textbook and most textbooks, and online, of course. You can find similar diagrams. Beginning always with the ovaries. So here's an ovary on this side, an ovary on this side. They are situated out into the body cavity a bit, and they are surrounded by a type of mesothelium, which we'll talk about here in a little while. Next to that, we have the oviduct right here on either side. The oviduct will carry the egg cell that's released from the ovary up toward the uterus, right? So anyway, the opening right here into the, let's put a little dotted line here. The opening into the oviduct there is known as an ostium, sometimes referred to as the ostium tubae. It's the opening to the tube, the ostium, the opening to the tube. The oviduct leads into the uterus. Here the oviduct has different parts to it. It has these long extensions that come out from the end here, and these are called fimbriae. Let's see, those structures have ciliated cells that help to generate a current of fluid, body cavity fluid, up into the tube, so that when the egg is released, even if it's released somewhere off opposite that there will be a general current of fluid that will carry the egg into the oviduct. The oviduct is divided into 4 general parts. There's no discrete lines separating them, but this first one here, this is called the infundibulum. It's more of a funnel type part. Then there's a thicker part leading through here. This is referred to as the ampulla. So it's a little bit wider for a bit, and then it narrows in this section right here, and where it's narrowed, it's called the isthmus. And then the last segment of the oviduct passes through the uterine wall, passes through the muscle right there, and that's simply called the uterine portion. Of the oviduct. So we have an infundibulum, ampulla, isthmus, and then the uterine portion of the oviduct leading in here. Those are also suspended out in the body cavity a bit, so that there's a membrane that extends to that and wraps around that. They have a mesothelial covering. All of this lies in front of the colon. The colon would pass behind here, and in front of that you would find the bladder. So this forms kind of a partition in the lower pelvic floor. So there's a front part of the pelvic floor and a back part divided by these organs and the membranes that come from the wall up to the uterus and the oviducts. Now the uterus is divided into different regions. The very top of it here, the domed portion, is referred to as the fundus or fundic region of the uterus. Very much like what we saw in the stomach and some other organs. Wherever there's a domed top, you can refer to it as a fundus. The next section, the main center of it here, is simply referred to as the body. And then it narrows down here, and we call this region in here, where it narrows before entering the vagina, we call that cervix. The name refers to a neck, so this is the narrowing, the neck of the uterus here. In the cervix region, there's a narrowing below the main body central region right here. It's called the superior os. This os refers to that narrowing, and then there's an inferior. The end of the cervix extends a little bit down into the upper part of the vagina. And the wall of the uterus has these layers, and we'll talk more about these later, but we'll go ahead and label this now. On the inside, there's a fairly thin layer of kind of a mucosa, epithelium, and connective tissues together make up what we refer to as the endometrium. The next layer is all muscle, and we call that the myometrium. And then the very outside is a very, very thin connective tissue and a mesothelial layer, essentially a serosa, but in this case we refer to it as the perimetrium, P-E-R-I, metrium. So we're going to look in detail at the histology in the ovary. We'll talk about stages of follicle development in the ovary. We'll look at the histology of the oviduct. We'll look at the histology of the uterine wall, and then finally the vaginal wall. In the ovary, we have on the very outside a covering, a mesothelial covering, but this mesothelium, instead of being a simple squamous epithelium, is a simple cuboidal epithelium. And we have a special name for that epithelium. It's called germinal epithelium. I think that at some point they thought that the egg cells had their origin in that epithelial covering because egg cells erupt from the surface of the ovary. But anyway, they're not. The actual egg cells have their beginning from deeper into the ovary. So anyway, this outer surface is still referred to as germinal epithelium. It's simply a cuboidal type of mesothelium. And the zone underneath of that, immediately underneath of it, there's a layer of dense connective tissue, or at least there could be. Let's see, it's a very, very thin layer that germinal epithelium rests on the outside. And this is referred to as the tunica albuginea. And again, that's the same term we've seen in some of the male reproductive system parts. It just refers to a white layer. So there's the white layer, that dense layer of connective tissue immediately underneath the germinal epithelium, the tunica albuginea. Under that, we get into the region we refer to as the cortex. Cortex tissue is what we often describe as a highly cellular connective tissue. Highly cellular connective tissue. So instead of having an abundance of collagen scattered all through here with just a few fibroblasts, we have a lot of cells with, instead of the typical fibroblast shape, they're more rounded cells. These are kind of granular cells. So we have this highly cellular connective tissue through here, a little bit of smooth muscle mixed in, and then the follicles. So in there we're going to see follicles. It's a good color for that. Let's choose brown here to start off with. The egg cells themselves are surrounded by follicles. I'm going to make these a little bit large just so they can be seen on the television or the computer screen here. So anyway, there's a layer of cuboidal cells surrounding an egg cell here. So that's a single primordial follicle. And this outer cortex in the young individual before puberty and in the early years of youth, they are populated with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these primordial follicles. In each one of these follicles, you have this large cell, that large egg cell, large nucleus and large nucleolus in there. very large cell surrounded by smaller follicle cells, those then surrounded by this highly cellular connective tissue with some smooth muscle, very few capillaries scattered through there as well. So that's the cortex, the ingredients of the cortex. Now the medulla in the center. The medulla has a loose connective tissue with blood vessels and nerves. More typical connective tissue with blood vessels, lots of blood vessels and nerves populating that central region there. So it does not look like the cortex region. It doesn't have that highly cellular connective tissue and smooth muscle component. Mostly vascular tissue and loose connective tissue and nerve in there. So next we are going to look at developmental stages of the follicle. So this simple primordial follicle that I've drawn here, like I said, there'd be hundreds of them scattered through the cortex. I've drawn it extra large so that we can see it here, but we're going to look at the different stages of follicle development that result in a ruptured follicle and the formation of what we call a corpus luteum. Here we're going to look at a few views of the ovary overall first. This is the very outside of the ovary along here, and it has the simple cuboidal germinal epithelium in there. And once you get inside of that, there's not a very distinct layer of more dense material right here on the edge. Really doesn't look all that different from the deeper material of the cortex. But sometimes you can tell that more dense layer on the outside, that tunica albuginea layer, but it really doesn't show up here in this view. Oh, there are a couple of primordial follicles up in here, but all of this is simple cortex material, consists of that highly cellular connective tissue with some smooth muscle kind of thrown in there. Looks kind of swirled about in there. No specific order to it. Next slide. Again, you have the germinal epithelium out here. You have some primordial follicles, and this is that highly cellular connective tissue out here. A little more collagen out here over on the tunica albuginea side. Another view, similar sort of thing. We have germinal epithelium. We have primordial follicles, so that's a primary oocyte, and these would be follicle cells around that. Another view of the simple cuboidal epithelium, the germinal epithelium on the outside of the ovary here, and this is ovary cortex here. This is more of the ovary cortex material, and here's a primordial follicle with oocyte and follicle cells making a ring around that. And here's a view in the medulla of the ovary. We have a nerve here, we've got a nerve down here, there's an artery, here's a vein, lots of collagen, that more reddish orange color in there is all collagen. So there's connective tissue, nerves, arteries, veins in the medulla of the ovary. Here on the board we have 3 stages of the early development of the follicle within the ovary. So at puberty, the influence of follicle stimulating hormone causes some of the follicles within the ovary to begin the development into mature follicles. Now, not many of them will initiate this first follicular development stage, and naturally some of them are saved for all of the following hormonal cycles that will come through life until menopause. So these are the first stages of development. Now this is the stage, the primordial stage, that all follicles in when they are in when they start. Around the very outside of these follicle cells, on the outside there is a basal lamina. I'll put that in orange here. I didn't put that in the drawings. So anyway, there's a basal lamina on the outside, a ring of small follicle cells that are almost flat, very, very low cuboidal, I guess we would call them, cells around the outside, of a single oocyte. Now this is considered, at this stage, a primary oocyte. And to the outside of that, we have follicle cells. And we have that basal lamina. This would be surrounded by that highly cellular connective tissue stroma, that network of cells on the outside of all of the follicles in the cortex region of the ovary. Under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, these begin to develop into eventually mature follicles. The first step between this is primordial follicle here. First step is to form a primary follicle, and all we see in the development of the primary follicle is the addition of a clear zone between the oocyte and the follicle cells, and we see an enlargement of the follicle cells so they become tall cuboidal or nearly columnar cells in here. But this clear zone is called a zona pellucida. Pellucida refers to being clear. Zona just means it's a zone or a region around there. So we have on the outside, we still have our basal lamina on the outside surrounding all these follicle cells. And we have the zona follicle cells, the zona pellucida, the clear zone, and then our primary oocyte. Still a primary oocyte at this stage. These follicle cells keep dividing and increasing in number. So this would be an early primary follicle. And this would be a later primary follicle. The next stage we'll enter will be a secondary follicle stage, and what we're going to see is that within this region of follicle cells surrounding the oocyte, we're going to see a cavity form. We're going to see a huge increase in the number of follicle cells, and then within that we're going to see a cavity form we're going to call the antrum. So we'll see the antrum formation. We'll also see tissues on the outside of the primary follicle begin to change. That stromal material, that highly cellular connective tissue on the outside, will begin to form some special layers we call the theca interna and the theca externa, very important layers. Forgot to put my basal lamina in orange around the outside of it. So anyway, those are primordial follicle, primary follicle. We start to see the increase in the number of cells here. We see the formation of the zona pellucida. So let's move on to the secondary follicle stage. So now we're on to a secondary follicle. This is secondary. A secondary follicle, the oocyte has progressed from a primary follicle stage to, a primary oocyte stage to a secondary oocyte as well. So now we have a secondary oocyte. In the process of that division, it produces what's called a polar body, which results in just a tiny packet of nuclear material that's discarded from the remainder of the egg cytoplasm here. So instead of dividing into two equal cells, we keep one large cell and just get rid of that extra bit of nuclear material in that nuclear division process. And that's called a polar body. It's our first polar body. So we still have our oocyte, we still have a zona pellucida in green. I put that clear zone, instead of trying to make it clear, I put green in there, so the green represents the zona pellucida. Then outside of that we have our follicle cells, and our follicle cells have increased even more in number, and as I mentioned before, within that zone of follicle cells we develop a cavity here. That cavity is referred to as an antrum. The antrum of the developing follicle. To the outside of the follicle cells, remember we had a basal lamina going around there, and then to the outside of your basal lamina, now we see two layers of tissue that are derived from those connective tissues that were outside of the follicle to begin with. These are referred to as the theca interna. These cells maintain basically a round shape and enlarge a bit. They will eventually be hormone-producing cells. And then outside of that, we have the theca externa. An external thecal layer and an internal thecal layer, layers associated with this developing follicle. To the outside of that would be more of the typical ovarian cortex tissue, that stromal tissue of a highly cellular connective tissue with a few smooth muscle cells thrown in. Okay, so we've progressed to our first meiotic division stage. We've got a secondary oocyte. We started to form an antrum. We started to form the thecal layers. In the next stage, we move on to what's called a mature or Graafian follicle, and the changes we will see there is that this antrum simply enlarges greatly. It becomes a large fluid-filled space, and as we increase that space, we see some specific regions we can name within all of these follicle cells out here. So that's the next step, is to show the mature follicle. I'm going to have to draw that a little bit differently. I can't include as much detail because of the sheer number of cells and so on. And now we have what we call a mature or Graafian follicle. Graafian spelled G-R-A-A-F-I-A-N. Graafian follicle, same as mature follicle. You use those terms interchangeably. Our oocyte is still a secondary oocyte. It will not go through the second meiotic division until after sperm actually penetrates into the oocyte. Then that second meiotic division will be completed. So this is still a secondary oocyte, still surrounded by zona pellucida, the green represented there. And then outside of that we have all these follicle cells, which I didn't draw in as tiny cells this time, just to kind of show what areas are which. We have an area around the oocyte here, kind of extending out into the antrum space, that is called a corona radiata. It's not a new structure really, it's just more follicle cells, and they're just kind of reshaped. And that part of that structure of follicle cells they call corona radiata. That region of follicle cells that attaches the oocyte to the follicle wall over here, this is referred to as the cumulus oophorus. Cumulus oophorus. And then the rest of the follicle cells simply enclose this large antrum space out here. So this is all antrum out here. And that thin layer that then encloses the entire antrum out here, these are referred to as granulosa cells. We'll call it the granulosa layer. The granulosa layer surrounds the antrum, and here on this side where the oocyte is, we have this attachment by the cumulus oophorus region of follicle cells, and then a covering of follicle cells we call the corona radiata. Outside of this, we still have that basal lamina. We have the theca interna cells and the theca externa cells in the ovary. This is a very large structure at this stage. It's easily visible, forms a little blister essentially on the surface of the ovary, a little bump out there, and eventually this will break open. When it breaks open, the oocyte with its corona radiata cells will move out of the ovary and be in the body cavity where it can be swept into the oviduct. After the oocyte leaves the ovary, it's at the time what we call ovulation. That oocyte with its surrounding follicle cells leaves the ovary surface. Those tissues of the ovarian follicle remain on the surface of the ovary, so most of the follicle structure is still there, and it makes a scar on the surface of the ovary, which initially has a small blood clot in the middle of it. The overall structure that's produced here, we see in orange, is what we call the corpus luteum. Corpus refers to body, luteum means yellow, so it's a little yellow body on the outside of the ovary, this scar tissue there. In the middle of that, initially, after it first erupts for the first little bit, there's a tiny blood clot left inside the middle of that, resulting from the ovulation process, and that's referred to as the corpus hemorrhagicum. Corpus hemorrhagicum. But that's quickly lost. It disappears fairly soon after ovulation. Over the next 12 days or so after ovulation, these cells actually proliferate into a hormone-producing structure on the surface of the ovary. They're producing both progesterones and estrogens. The cells that were originally part of the the mass of follicle cells, they produce nice rounded cells within the corpus luteum, large masses of these, and I can't draw the whole thing out. There would be thousands and thousands of these cells, but anyway, just to draw a little piece of what would be in that histology of that corpus luteum. Nice round cells derived from follicle cells, and then some smaller cells derived from the theca interna. So here I'm going to draw some theca interna cells alongside here and along over here. These are derived from that theca interna layer. These are also hormone-producing cells. The follicle cells are thought to produce more of the estrogens, the progesterone, more progesterone from the follicle cells, more estrogens from the theca interna cells. In addition to those features, we also see some fibrous tissue derived from that theca externa. So running through here, dividing up sections. So this would be a huge thing, but anyway, you'll see little bits of this theca externa worked in among those hormone-producing cells, more of a structural tissue, a fibrous tissue in among the hormone-producing cells derived from follicle cells and theca interna cells. The cells in here in the center that are derived from follicle cells are referred to as granulosa lutein cells, and those derived from the theca interna are referred to as theca lutein cells. So those two cell types, theca lutein cells, granulosa lutein cells, make up the corpus luteum, that yellow body in there. More progesterones from the granulosa, more estrogens from the theca cells in there. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, if the oocyte that left does not encounter a sperm cell and become fertilized and then embed itself inside the wall of the uterine lining, if that does not happen, this begins to fade after about the 12th day. We should see a regression. Eventually it becomes a tiny, what they often describe as hyaline, kind of glassy structure. The cellular makeup breaks down, the cells die out, and we call it a corpus albicans. It's a white body. The last bit of scar tissue that you see there on the surface of the ovary resulting from the ovulation. Now, we've seen what happens with the remains of the follicle tissue here, but not all of our follicles that begin to develop in the ovary are going to go through and mature and release the oocyte. Some of the follicles, after they start to develop, they stop. Usually there's only one of the follicles that reaches maturity in each hormonal cycle. So there might be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 follicles that start to develop during any given cycle, but only one of them reaches the mature stage. The others are what we call atretic follicles. They undergo the process of atresia. That just means that they are eventually regress and reabsorbed by the ovary. I forgot to mention that if pregnancy does occur, you maintain your corpus luteum for like up to 8 weeks. If the oocyte is fertilized, the egg cell is fertilized as it comes up here, it will eventually embed into the endometrial layer, and where it embeds in the endometrial layer, there are cells that will be produced here that produce a hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. If this hormone is being produced in the tissues around the embryo, in the wall of the endometrium right here, that hormone will cause the corpus luteum to retain itself in there and not regress after the normal 12 to 14 days. That is typical of that. So it stays in there and producing more and more progesterone, and progesterone is required to maintain the endometrial lining of the uterus. It's the loss of progesterone after the decrease in the corpus luteum, the loss of that hormone, progesterone, that causes the endometrial lining to be lost at menstruation. So if implantation of the embryo occurs, that little embryo will start to produce human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, that will stimulate the corpus luteum to keep producing progesterone, like I said, for up to 8 weeks. Eventually, the embryo itself will be producing all the hormones required to keep from losing the internal lining of the uterus there. Now we're going to look at follicle stages. All these are primordial follicles. We have the primary oocytes scattered around in here, and then the small cells at their borders. These are all follicle cells, and they're all in the cortex where we have that connective tissue that's not very well organized, highly cellular but not well organized. Here's a primary follicle. So we've gone beyond primordial. Now we're in primary. Here's our oocyte. We can see its nucleus in here, and we're beginning to get this zona pellucida. It shows up as kind of a red-orange, red-purple color around here now. But our follicle cells are all taller than they were previously. Here's another example of primary follicles. Notice the follicle cells here are just a little bit larger than what you'd see on a primordial follicle, and here we have at least a couple layers of follicle cells surrounding our primary oocyte in here. Secondary follicles now, we have a large antrum space here. Our egg cell would be here. We can begin to see the start of layers, theca interna, theca externa layers to the outside of our follicle cells out here. So we have an egg cell nested in over here. We've got an antrum. Another view of that same thing here. So these are our follicle cells. These right in here would be theca interna cells, and then these out here would be theca externa cells. Here's a mature follicle, large antrum. There's our oocyte space. So this layer out here of follicle cells, the dark cells out here, this is the granulosa layer. In here, those under the oocyte would be the cumulus oophorus, and these over here would be corona radiata cells. Here we have another view of a mature follicle. This is all antrum, a large antrum space here. Our egg, our oocyte would be here. This, of course, would be a secondary oocyte after the secondary follicle stage. And this is our corona radiata over here, and this is our cumulus oophorus region on this side here. If we had more magnification here, we could see the separation of our theca interna and theca externa. They're a little hard to make out at this magnification. The darker line, those are all the granulosa layer out there. Now we're looking at corpus luteum cells, corpus luteum. There are some larger pale staining cells with their nuclei pretty well spaced through here that result from the follicle cells of the original follicle. So those are called granulosa lutein cells, granulosa lutein cells. Then we have smaller cells in here where the nuclei are more closely packed, and these are derived from the theca interna. So those are called theca lutein cells. They are both hormone-producing cells. Remember that the granulosa lutein cells were thought to be more involved in production of progesterones, and then the theca lutein cells in the production of estrogens. This doesn't show very well the material from the theca externa, but there's little bits of that fibrous tissue showing up in here, and there are blood vessels going through in here because, remember, this is a hormone supplying structure for quite a while. Another view of corpus luteum, and again you can see the larger cells down here that are granulosa lutein cells, and then the smaller ones up here that are theca lutein cells, and bits of fiber like structures from that theca externa material. Another view, not much different. There's an artery going through right here, a nice blood vessel. Down here in this region we have the granulosa lutein cells. Up here we have theca lutein cells. This is low magnification of that same structure looking at the corpus luteum. So you can see most of this has that pale look to it. There are bits of the darker cells, the smaller cells from theca lutein. So most of this is granulosa lutein cells. And you can see these little lines going through here, lines set up by that material of the theca externa, more of a structural material than a secretory material. After the corpus luteum is done its work, it pretty much dies, and the material that's left forms this kind of a lattice-looking tissue. It's not cellular, but you can still see the fibers that are left behind by that theca externa material. That's called the corpus albicans,